So normally after the first hard frost, you can come out and cut the stems of the dahlias down. There's no particular rush after that in terms of when you dig them. The longer you leave them in the ground, the better the chance that the eyes will start to develop. But when it comes time to digging, what you want to do is to try to loosen the soil and gently lift the clumps so you don't break too many tubers. And remember that some of these tubers get rather large, so you have to stay back. And you want to start by loosening the soil all the way around. And then when you're about ready to take it off, it's generally a very good idea to take the label and tie it around the stem so you don't end up losing the identification. And then when you gently lift it, then you can bang it to knock the dirt off. And you're done. Okay. All right. At this point, you can either, normally if the temperatures are going to remain above freezing, you can leave the clump out overnight and let it dry a little. Many people wash their tubers, so you can simply take a hose and remove all of the dirt. And then you would leave this out again overnight to let it dry as long as the temperatures are above freezing. If not, you can bring them inside, but be sure that you do not store them directly on concrete, because the concrete will tend to pull a lot of moisture out of the tubers. And then usually within a day, you should begin dividing them and preparing them for storage. All right, so I'm going to demonstrate how to divide a clump of tubers. This particular clump, I'm going to demonstrate how to do the minimal division for storing them. The first thing you want to do with your clump is to get rid of all of these little roots that are coming off the tip of the tuber. These are what are known as feeder roots. They're just going to dry up in the winter, and you don't really need them on there or want them on there. So the first thing you can do is just go through and get rid of them all. The next thing you want to do is, the tuber itself is designed and will basically go into a dormancy during the winter. And the only reason a tuber would rot is if it is infected or if it gets too wet during the storage period. On the other hand, the stem will definitely rot, and so in order to avoid having the rot go down the stem and to the tuber, what you want to do is to make sure that the stem is cut from the clump and it's divided at least in half so that it has a chance to dry out rather than rot. So the next thing you want to do is to basically, and as you can see, is cut the stem off as low as you can. All right, so here you can see the clump. I've removed the stem, and what you want to do is to make sure that this stem dries out so that it doesn't stay wet and rot. So minimally what you should do is take the clump and cut it right through the center of the stem. And this will ensure that the stem now has a chance to dry out, and that will reduce the chances of it spreading any rot. So it's possible to take a clump like this, divide it in half, and store the clump this way, and then in the spring, after you see it eyeing up, you can further divide it rather than doing it in the fall. Here's a clump where I will divide it up into as many tubers as I can. You can see that I have already removed all of the root hairs. And here you can see an individual tuber. And this little swollen part on the end is what we call the crown. The crown is usually attached to the stem, and the crown is where the eyes will appear. And so in order to have a tuber that is going to produce a plant next year, you have to have a crown that has an eye on it. And so what you are trying to do is to divide it in such a way that every tuber has a good crown with at least one eye on it. So usually the easiest way to start this is with a knife and identify the clumps and simply cut them free. So here you can see a tuber. It has a crown and there's presumably an eye in there, although I can't see it. Here's another tuber with an eye. And so again, with a knife, I can remove that. It's also a good idea after you remove a tuber to also trim away any of the stem that happens to be hanging on, because that stem, remember, can rot and the rot can spread to the crown. Here you can see another two tubers. These I could leave together. But it looks like there's probably sufficient crown on either one of these to have eyes appear. So I can take this one and cut it in half. And basically you just keep working your way around until you've removed all of the possibilities. Now you're always going to come to a situation where you're not sure whether you have enough eyes, in which case it's best to just remove a bigger clump of tubers and trim away the stem, and then just leave it in this condition and then wait until the spring where you can potentially see more eyes, and then you might be able to further divide it. But these tubers now are all divided and these are ready for storage. Notice that sometimes you're going to see tubers like this which look like they have more tubers coming out of the tuber. These tubers will not produce eyes and they will not produce shoots next year. It doesn't hurt to leave them on there during and then remove them in the spring, but these individual small tubers that come off of, and sometimes they're large, don't really have a crown. The crown is only the part that's usually attached to the stem of the plant. Okay, here's another tuber. These eyes are a little more developed, but here you can see there's about 3 eyes developing here. And again, these will eventually turn into the new shoots next spring. Here we have a clump. Sometimes the clumps are very easy to divide. It's easy to see where the crowns are and easy to see how to remove them. And sometimes the clumps are like this, which is more of a challenge. And really all you can do with clumps like this is dive in and try to preserve as much as you can, and then wait until the spring till they eye up before you do any further division. And usually you don't have to worry about that, because eventually you're going to end up with so many tubers that it's not really worth trying to divide them all the way. So whenever I have a clump like this, what I tend to do is to first remove the stem so I can see what I'm working with. And then you just have to dive in and make a cut to try to divide it. In this particular case, it looks like there's a clump of tubers here that I could probably remove with a knife. When doing it, you're always going to end up losing some tubers when you have such a tight clump here. It makes it very difficult to separate them. So there is a clump, and now you can start to see a little bit better, a little clearer as to what's going on here. You can see in the process, though, I managed to lose a few tubers, but there's nothing you can really do about that. So now it's possible to further cut this and divide it into larger clumps, which you can then store till next year, now that it's a little easier to see what you've got going there. And here you can see I'm still dealing with the stem, and so it's probably a good idea to divide this stem in half and trim away as much of the stem as I can, and leaving this and storing them in this situation, because it's very difficult to see all of the eyes and where they're going to develop. And so when you have these clumps which just look like huge masses of tubers, all you can really do is dive in, separate them, make a cut down the middle, and then try to subdivide them this way. Not all dahlias are that way, but those are the ones that are usually the challenge when it comes to dividing. Another possibility for these is to simply divide the clump in half and store it that way, just to make sure that you've got stem exposed so that it will dry out as opposed to begin rotting. Once the tubers have been cut and divided, I'll talk a little bit about storage. The storage technique that seems to work very well was making use of these Ziploc bags that were designed for vegetables in the refrigerator, and they're perforated and they had a lot of little holes. And it turned out that this combination of bag and holes was exactly right for maintaining enough moisture but not allowing too much moisture. So the tubers kept very well. Unfortunately, the Ziploc no longer makes these smart bags, but what somebody figured out is you can take a regular Ziploc bag, you can purchase one of these gizmos that makes holes in wallpaper that makes it easier for you to remove the wallpaper, and you can simply run this over the bag, which creates a similar number of little holes. And now we have a Ziploc bag that will work exactly like the old Ziploc Smart Bag. Then what you want to do is basically take your label, put it in the bag, and then you can simply put the tubers in the bag, seal the bag, and these will store very well in this condition. Periodically, it's not a bad idea to check them to see if there's a little too much moisture in there. If there is, you can always open the bag and let them dry out for a day or two and then reseal the bag. It's also very easy to keep an eye on these during the course of the winter, so that if you see any that are rotting, you can remove them. And this is a technique that a lot of people are using, and it works very well. Prior to storing your tubers in the bag, there are some people that like to treat the tubers with a fungicide, and there are two or three that are commonly used. One is to simply take some sulfur dusting and put them in a bag like you were going to be breading some chicken, and knock the tubers around in there and they will get coated with sulfur, which is a way to help preserve them and reduce the fungus. Another method is to use a liquid solution of either banrot is commonly used or captan. Basically you can fill it up in a 5-gallon bucket. You can get an old colander and make it a situation like this, and then simply dip them in the solution, leave them in there for 30 seconds to a minute, pull them out, remove the tubers, allow them to dry, and then put them in your bags. And as I said, many people don't do either of these techniques, and it seems to work very well to just store them directly without treating them. Once your tubers have all been put into their plastic bags, the question is, where do you put the bags? Well, basically you just want to put them somewhere where they're going to be cool and in the dark, and typically temperatures below 50 degrees are ideal. Here's one possibility is to use paper boxes. You can notice that these boxes have holes in them to allow some air circulation, and you can simply put the bags of tubers in here. You don't want to ram them in too tightly, but as long as you have some air circulation, and then this box can be closed up and stored for the winter. Alternatively, if you don't have paper boxes, you can easily go and get some of these plastic tubs, and you can store the tubers in these tubs, and these can basically, you can start off usually in the winter with maybe the lid slightly ajar to allow some of the moisture to escape, and then later you can put the cover on completely, and again, this is a very convenient storage technique.